moving along. So this is Judi Lowe's confirmation seminar. Judi Lowe has an unusual background in maritime law, unusual for most of the people here, not unusual in other places. Judi has about 30 years experience in the dive tourism industry. So she's done a lot of dive training, she's been involved in dive businesses, and she's seen a lot of dive businesses, and she's wondered over that time what sort of contributions they can and do make to marine conservation, but also to livelihoods, especially in developing countries. And that led her to choose this PhD topic, which she'll now tell us about.
Indeed, I will. Thank you, Bob. And thanks everyone for coming, and welcome to my confirmation seminar. We've got Vanessa Adams on the phone, on Skype actually, because the G20 means that Brisbane is shut down and she can't get to her office. So she's with us in more than she's with us in practice. So coral reefs are under threat, and marine protected areas are one of the tools used to conserve coral reefs. The UNEP Atlas in 2001 showed that there are 660 MPAs worldwide that incorporate coral reefs, but that many exist purely on paper. They are poorly managed and have little or no support for enforcement, and they fail to produce tangible conservation benefits. 75% of the world's coral reefs are located in or around the equator in some of the world's poorest nations. And this coincidence of geography tends to mean that the future of coral reefs and artisanal fishes living in poverty in less developed countries are inextricably linked. Fishers depend on coral reef ecosystems for food security and income. And what's the role of dive tourism in all of this? Dive tourism is often cited as a private sector contributor to ICM for its capacity to generate sustainable finance from marine protected areas and to create livelihoods for fishers. It's not known whether dive tourism is able to fulfill these objectives, and not all dive tourism is alike. Some dive tourism operations make extensive positive contributions to ICM and to livelihoods, and others make significant negative contributions. My research will actually look at the impact of dive tourism on ICM and on livelihoods, and whether dive tourism has the effect of decreasing overfishing. So this morning, or today at lunchtime, we'll look at some background on integrated coastal management and on livelihoods and dive tourism, and then look at how my research will be structured, and then look at the chapters and some project milestones. So the background that we'll go to will be dive tourism, as I was saying, ICM livelihoods and traditional marine tenure and success in terms of dive tourism's optimal contributions to ICM and to livelihoods. Oh, what's happening there? Okay. So dive tourism has been defined by Garrett and Gosling, who are prominent marine tourism authors, as individuals travelling from their usual place of residence, spending at least one night away and actively participating in one or more activities, including scuba diving, snorkeling, snooper, or the use of rebreathing apparatus. I might have to take a poll later on who knows what snooper is. Does anyone know what snooper is? I didn't either. It's basically a surface-supplied form of breathing, and it's a bit like hooker, but it's a recreational sort of a version, so less kind of commercial. Integrated coastal management is a management framework which encourages the sustainable use of coral reef resources and addresses environmental conflict between user groups. It's been defined by White in 2005 as a broad and dynamic process that requires the active and sustained involvement of the interested public and many stakeholders with interests in how coastal resources are allocated and conflicts mediated. ICM often uses MPAs as a management tool, and ICM is strengthened by private sector participants. And dive tourism actually is a private sector participant in integrated coastal management. For ICM to be sustainable, White developed a model with others, White et al. Developed a model in 2005, which has 9 factors for sustainable ICM. The first is improvements to biophysical conditions, which are things like the condition of corals, fish biomass, and the presence of megafauna. Stakeholder participation in decision making, economic returns and livelihoods. Economic returns are things like taxes and fees to government, but also marine protected area user fees or dive user fees in this case. An adequate legal and policy framework, law enforcement capacity, building durable institutions beyond leadership change, the role of the private sector in performing tasks, avoiding dependence on project versus government functions, education and awareness raising. Now, I've added a 10th factor to White's framework, which is the recognition of traditional marine tenure. The reason that I've done this is that traditional marine tenure is not actually recognised within White's framework, and the reason for that, I contacted the authors and asked them why, was that they consider that for tenure to be an important factor that's going to bring benefits to in forms of livelihoods, it needs to be legally recognised. But the reality is that traditional marine tenure is rarely recognised in a formal sense in law, but it's still a very important and increasingly important sort of a factor. So that's why I've added it here to White's framework. And in doing that, I actually, again spoke with the authors, and they agreed that it was probably a good thing in this day and age to add to the framework. So my role looks at the role of the private sector, the role of dive tourism as a private sector operator, and I will be looking at all of the factors in terms of dive tourism and the effect that dive tourism has on those different factors. Livelihoods, you'll see, are covered in White's framework, but because they're so central to the to coral reef resources, I'm also going to cover them quite completely and separately. The White's framework is based on the success and failure of major ICM projects in Indonesia and the Philippines. It's a good model for assessing the impact of dive tourism on ICM because it includes the social, economic, environmental factors necessary for sustainable ICM. It also recognises that fishers rely on coral reef resources for food security and a need for balance between the two. And it acknowledges the role of dive tourism as a private sector provider, as a source of sustainable finance, but also in other ways. Now we'll have a look at some of my research design. There are 5 research gaps and objectives which then lead in a dovetailed fashion through into research questions. The first gap is the role of dive tourism as a private sector participant in ICM. We don't really understand fully what that role is or what dive tourism can do and what it can't do, which leads to my first objective. The second gap is, does all dive tourism behave the same way, and are there impacts which have not been researched, leading to the second objective? The third gap breaks down into 2 parts, so the role of dive tourism in providing livelihoods for fishers, and whether livelihoods from dive tourism actually reduce overfishing. The fourth gap is whether recognition of traditional marine tenure has any effect on the provision of livelihoods by dive tourism. And the fifth gap is whether factors lead to success, or which factors actually lead to success in terms of dive tourism's optimal contributions on ICM and livelihoods. And I've defined optimal contribution as the maximum positive contributions to ICM and livelihoods and minimising negative contributions. So my research questions are, the first one is, what are the impacts of dive tourism on ICM as recorded in the literature? Are all dive tourism operators having the impact on ICM recorded in the literature, and are there impacts which have not been captured in the literature? What are the types and amounts of contributions of dive tourism to livelihoods for fishers, and do they reduce overfishing? Does the recognition of traditional marine tenure affect the provision of livelihoods for fishers by dive tourism? And what are the criteria which lead to success in terms of dive tourism's optimal impact on ICM and livelihoods, and under what condition can success be replicated? Now, in my research design, I've chosen a convergent, parallel, mixed methods approach. So in this approach, the quantitative and qualitative data will actually be collected and analysed in parallel, and the results are analysed separately and then merged. To ensure that this design runs smoothly, the concepts which are addressed by the online survey, the quantitative online survey, and the key stakeholder interviews are largely the same, and that allows you to compare results as you move through. In chapters 2 to 5, I'll use this quantitative survey, and it will be an online survey of dive tourism operators between the tropics of Capricorn and Cancer, where most of the coral reefs lie. It'll identify the impacts of White's framework that dive tourism operators are actually contributing to. The population will be stratified by size and country and so forth, to be able to understand how many of those different participants are actually responding, and then to be able to contact them again if that's necessary. And to improve the response rate, surveys will actually be sent out with email support from dive certification agencies like PADI, so that and that will also help me with following up to find out which survey responses I've received and which haven't. So also in follow-up, we'll have unique identifiers to be able to follow up. I will actually control for social desirability bias by actually including a question in the survey. And the reason for that is that a lot of the questions are based on the perception of dive tourism operators. And the data will be analysed in various ways, but one of them will be using ordination with PCA and SPSS. Now, this is a little chart that shows you how the key stakeholder interviews and associated stakeholders, how the dive tourism operator and associated stakeholders will be, who I'll actually be talking to. I'll select perhaps 3 or 4 different dive tourism operators for key stakeholder interviews for Chapter 5, and for each one, go out and talk to fishers who receive livelihoods from dive tourism operators, other people in their communities, and to try and get some more information about biophysical conditions and the effect of overfishing. I will talk to some NGOs in the area and also to government departments, so people like the Mayor perhaps, or fisheries or environment departments. There may be some sites where biophysical information, scientific information is actually available, but where it's not, movements in overfishing will be collected using perception. Now, in terms of what I mean by positive deviance in the selection of dive tourism operators, if this sort of mock chart showed you where dive tourism operators sit, roughly speaking, in terms of their contributions to ICM and livelihoods, then these dive tourism operators here, who are making the maximum contributions to ICM and the maximum contributions to livelihoods, are the ones that I'm interested in terms of being able to learn from their success, learn from what they're doing, and see whether or not there are any lessons that can be applied to other dive tourism operators. In Chapter 5, there has a couple of elements. The first is understanding what the factors for success are, and the second is understanding whether or not those factors can actually be replicated. So, and it will, the key stakeholder interviews are primarily to answer question 5, but they will also be able to add important insights into questions 2 to 4. So the collection and analysis, the interviews will actually be stopped once we reach saturation point in terms of the information that we're receiving, and information will be uploaded into NVivo, and a thematic analysis will be performed, and I would expect that the key factors for success would arise from that analysis. In Chapter 4, I'm going to use some legal research to build a legal framework of traditional marine tenure to show us where use rights actually exist over coral reef resources below the high tide mark. And I'll be looking at international law and national laws and conventions to find out where traditional marine tenure exists at law and where it actually exists in practice. Now, this is a got a little information on this table, but what the idea of it is just to show you that the different methods, we've got the quantitative survey, the qualitative key stakeholder interviews and legal research. And then, so if we take the quantitative survey, for example, its primary use will be to answer chapters 2, 3 and 4, and then some supplemental information will come into chapter 5, and so on and so forth. The data source are the dive tourism operators for the online survey. This is the associated stakeholders for the key stakeholder interviews, and so on and so forth. Now, so you can see that I have 5 chapters in my thesis. Literature review, dive tourism and integrated coastal management, dive tourism and livelihoods, traditional marine tenure, and the theory for success. So my literature review will be a systematic analysis of integrated coastal management and of livelihoods, traditional marine tenure, and dive tourism in terms of White's framework. It will lead to a picture of the positive and negative impacts of dive tourism on ICM as recorded in the literature. In chapter 2, I have a couple of sub-questions which are all dive tourism operators having the same effects on ICM as recorded in the literature, and are there impacts which have not been captured in the literature? So the methods that we have looked at before. The primary method is the quantitative online survey, and the secondary method, the data will be supplemented with key stakeholder interviews. This is a range of key positive impacts which have been drawn from the literature. I think Mike Fabini should know a few of them because they come from his work on livelihoods. Actually, no, that's the next phrase, the negative. Okay, so some of these factors, for example, supporting legislation which will actually improve marine conservation efforts, providing boats and fuel for compliance, training fishers as rangers, for example, better coral cover which might come from no-take zones, that sort of thing. And this is a few of the negative impacts that have come from the literature that Mike would be more familiar with. So for example, dive tourism can ostracise fishers from fishing grounds by creating no-take zones and not allowing them to fish there, much the same way that marine protected areas do. It can diminish livelihoods by creating inequality. Anchors can damage corals, fins can bump and break corals, and so on and so forth. If we want to see how we fit these effects into White's framework, we pick poor buoyancy, for example. We move over into White's framework, and you'll see that it actually fits in under biophysical conditions, so it's a negative impact on biophysical conditions. If we pick a positive impact, for example, works with government, this one comes from Brunschweiler's article on dive tourism in Fiji with bull sharks, and it relates to creating compliance tours, I suppose, with fishermen used as rangers, so they train people as rangers and move on that way. So if we look at White's framework, that would come in under number 5 and law enforcement. So we'll see that there are a range of varying impacts on dive tourism, from dive tourism onto ICM and livelihoods, from the negative to the positive, or from the positive to the negative. And it's not really clear why that might be. What are the different things? What are the reasons that cause one operator to have significantly positive contributions to ICM and livelihoods and another to be quite negative? Now, to research livelihoods, I've got 2 sub-questions. The first is, what are the types and amounts of contributions of dive tourism to livelihoods? And do livelihoods from dive tourism reduce overfishing? Again, we're using methods that we've spoken of before. I'm going to use an adaptation of Schoon's model to do this. And in Schoon's model, individual fishers would have a range of capital assets, which are their livelihood resources. And that mix of capital assets would result in them choosing a livelihood strategy. In this case, we're going to look at dive tourism. So a livelihood strategy would then have an impact on the different socioeconomic and environmental factors. So we're looking here at overfishing particularly, but also at habitats and biodiversity. This is a list of transfers and payments that dive tourism makes to livelihoods. And this list has been compiled from the literature, but also from the internet, so dive tourism operator websites, and from social media sources like LinkedIn and Facebook. A number of operators have sites where they would record that they're doing certain things, for example. So it'd be pretty unlikely for any one operator to do all of those things. For example, if you've got community benefit, one operator might do one of those things or a couple of them, but rarely would people do all of them. You'll often see dive tourism operators reporting that they employ locals, but they might in fact employ very few locals and mostly make up their staff with expatriates. And they might keep them into fairly low-skilled jobs that are low-paid. And it's only really some of the operators at the top end who would be training people perhaps as dive professionals, training them to do higher-level skills, and who have a high proportion of local people as staff, as opposed to, some of the better operators actually have all local staff, with the exception of the owners and perhaps the manager of the dive shop, something along those lines. Now, in terms of recognition of traditional marine tenure, I have 3 sub-questions. So is tenure recognised in legislation or in practice? Does dive tourism recognise tenure? And if so, what actions does dive tourism take in recognition of tenure? So before colonisation, traditional marine tenure regulated access to coral reef resources. And rights were usually held as community property by groups bound together by kinship and residence and recognised by neighbouring groups. Traditional marine tenure was extinguished by common and civil law systems, which hold that private property rights don't exist below the high tide mark, so coral reef resources are considered open access. Property rights through the recognition of traditional marine tenure is an emerging issue in less developed countries globally. And this has very much become the case because of the perception of the growing scarcity of coral reef resources. Secure access to coral reef resources through formal, informal, traditional or other means is critical if vulnerable households are to enjoy sustainable livelihoods. And traditional marine tenure is not just about ownership, it also includes the right to occupy, use or enjoy coral reef resources, and to harvesting and collecting and commercial uses like selling, mortgaging or leasing. All of the traditional marine tenure rights really need to be respected, not just those based on law formally documented by governments. So why is this important to dive tourism? Ambiguity in property rights can actually be the driver of non-compliant behaviour in no-take zones and marine protected areas. And conflict arises between dive tourism operators and fishers. As Fabini and Aracion have shown with their studies in the Philippines, researchers found that conflict does emanate from disputes and resentment over ambiguity of property rights. And my research will investigate the recognition of traditional marine tenure to see whether it leads to the provision of livelihoods by dive tourism and any lessening of conflict. In Chapter 5, I've got 4 sub-questions. What factors lead to success in terms of the optimal impacts of ICM and livelihoods? What obstacles were overcome? Have ICM and livelihoods reduced overfishing? Can success be replicated by others? And the methods are key stakeholder interviews with positively deviant dive operators, with a smaller group of key stakeholder interviews with expert practitioners in ICM and livelihoods, to just be able to get a much clearer view on whether those factors can actually be replicated. And there will be some supplementary information coming from the quantitative surveys. In terms of the selection criteria for the sort of 3 or 4 dive tourism operators where I would minister key stakeholder interviews, the operator would need to be a profitable going concern to be able to have any positive impact on marine conservation. And I think that the best way to do this is to look at the different factors for success, ICM and livelihoods, and then to rank dive tourism operators against those factors in terms of how many things that they do and to what extent. Now, this is a draft list of factors for success drawn from the literature, the scientific literature and the grey literature, and again from internet searches of dive tourism operator websites and a couple of social media sites. And the reason for doing it this way is to understand at this earlier point, what types of things are being done, so what are dive tourism operators around the world actually doing. So again, you'll find that not everyone is going to be doing all of these things, and it would be probably the upper order operators who would be operating at this end of the scale, doing things like building more durable institutions. Most operators would be doing these biophysical things like using moorings instead of anchors and so on and so forth. But the objective of this list and the next list that I'll show you is to use them to put into the quantitative survey to give operators something to, and asking them which items they're actually doing, which actions that they're taking, and then, and also I'm going to use these lists to ask them which actions they think are able to be replicated by other operators. So this is the list you've seen before. It's a draft list of factors for success for livelihoods, in the sense of what are the different things that dive tourism operators around the world are doing. Probably the least common factor is this one, paying locals not to fish. That's reasonably uncommon, but it does happen. For example, Missoul Eco Resort in Raja Ampat does that. So does Beggar Adventure Divers in Fiji, and there are a number of other operators who do that as a trade-off for, I suppose, locking fishes out of no-take zones. This is just to give you an idea of how I'm going to do that ranking. So this is a summary of the list that I've shown you, and I actually already started this process. So if you look at each dive tourism operator and then mark off which impacts they're having or which actions they're taking, and then I'll end up with a list of a ranked list of dive tourism operators, and I'd aim to choose the top 3 or the top 4. As I was saying, replication is a very important factor, because there's no point in having a list of extraordinary things that some operators do if they can't be replicated possibly by other tourism operators. Some of the constraints that might actually stop operators from replicating different success factors are location, in the sense that is a dive tourism operator, are they locking us in? You're stuck with me now. Hello. Come in, please. We need a bigger audience. Okay, so location, really talking about whether an operator is on an island on their own, or whether they're perhaps one operator in a rank of 8 along the shoreline. And that's sort of, some of these factors play into sort of mass dive tourism, as well, as opposed to perhaps what you'd call an all-inclusive resort, which is one that's more likely to be located on their own. In an all-inclusive resort, you'd actually go and you stay there and you do all your dives there, you have all your meals there, and you have no expense, generally speaking, outside of the fee that you've paid to go and dive there. And whether or not an operator is a day diver, so that's where you'd go to a dive operator, pay to do a dive or 2 dives or 3 dives, and then you go away and you may or may not come back the following day. But some of the research already indicates that these are not defining factors in terms of whether dive operators make major contributions to RCM or to livelihoods. Now, replication then, as I've really said, the objective of studying replication is to understand the circumstances under which those factors can be replicated. And I'm going to do that in 3 different ways. The first is to put those 2 lists that I showed you of draft lists as factors for success for ICM and to livelihoods into the quantitative survey and ask the opinion of dive operators or the perception as to whether those factors can be replicated and perhaps why or why not. They'll also go into the key stakeholder interviews to ask the successful dive tourism operators what their view is on which factors can be replicated, how and why. And then they'll also be used as a basis to talk to experienced ICM and dive tourism experts to give, again, a broader overview of where they think different factors can be replicated. In terms of the broader implications of my research, in theory, my research will extend White's framework by adding tenure and apply White's framework to dive tourism. It'll also apply Schoon's framework to dive tourism. It'll build on economic valuation of megafauna studies. Now, by this point, what I mean is there are a number of studies at the moment that are putting a value on a shark, a whale shark, a piece of coral reef, for example, for dive tourism. So, for example, Viana's studies on sharks in Palau, they'll value a single reef shark at, say, $1.8 million over its lifetime to dive tourism, but to a fisherman who kills it just for shark finning, it's only valued at, say, $180. But what all of these valuation studies are missing is the link between the livelihood for the person, the fisherman who's actually killing the shark for finning, is actually getting that $800. If that money from dive tourism is going to an expatriate dive tourism operator, there's absolutely no link necessarily to the fisherman who would have earned some money. So really, if livelihoods, if the economic valuation of megafauna is really only going to assist dive tourism operators and not assist fishers, then I don't know that it's necessarily having the effect that those studies are all talking about. So in terms of looking at whether livelihoods from dive tourism are going to have an effect on overfishing and reduce overfishing, that's how I'll be building on these economic valuation studies. I will also establish whether recognition of traditional marine tenure actually does leave dive operators to provide more livelihoods, really, I suppose, based on property rights or an equity issue. And then my work will also develop theories of factors for success. In practice, ICM managers would be able to use this research to refine their private sector engagement strategies. The dive industry could use these frameworks for ICM and livelihoods, the factors for success, in terms of looking at the range of things that they can do, and whether or not they want to or they do is a separate matter. My research could also be used in international development for a better understanding of the importance of recognition of tenure, whether it makes an impact or whether it doesn't. Now, my project milestones, you can see that there are a range of administrative functions and a range of administrative drafting effectively that's underway. This is my timeline over the 3-year period. And this is my publications plan. Now, it might think it a little bit unusual to see 8 publications in a PhD, but let me explain a little bit more about it. This first one, the research note, which goes to the Annals of Tourism Research, this is the top-ranked journal for tourism. And the idea of a research note, which should actually be about 1,200 words by the time you remove all the references, is that you foreshadow coming research which uses innovative models and actually brings other frameworks into tourism for analysis that haven't been used before, and it generally tends to foreshadow the types of results that you'd be likely to see. You would then generally, again, follow up with an article later in the journal. So the drafting of that research note is well underway. There's the first, you can see that I've got 3 literature reviews effectively. The first one is complete. The second 2, the reason this has happened is that I suppose, I don't know, something about the way I work, I suppose, with all the reading that I had done, I tended to sort of do that writing as I was going through and ended up with kind of a monster paper that was about 46 pages. So instead of just extracting 12 pages and leaving the rest alone, it's been decided that they can be well published in as 3 separate literature reviews, which all lead to the same topic. And then the last 4 are my data chapters. My risk management plan, I suppose the highest risk is that if I were to need to research in Indonesia, which is a strong possibility, that I may not get my research permit on time because there is quite a process for getting research permits, a risk tech. But the way of treating for that is allowing enough time for that process to take place, and that the online component of that research permit is already in. If though the research permit wasn't granted, I would just be able to move to other countries, for example the Philippines, where research permits are not required. This is my budget. And some credits for some of my underwater photos. And a thanks to a range of people. Bob Cressy, Natalie Stockwell, who was instrumental in helping at one point in formulating my questions. Vanessa, who should still be on the phone, and Christina Hicks and Professor Hilda Toby at Varkeningen in the Netherlands. That's it. Are there any questions? I think I've lost Vanessa sadly.
So I missed how you said you were going to deal with people, the dive operators, chances of them giving more positive answers than reality.
Yeah. So Ricardo Welters over in economics had a chat to Ricardo about that because he used this method in his own work. So what you would do is to actually insert a question into the questionnaire that it's something generic about, it's something sort of moral or generic, like for example, if an old lady fell over in front of you, you would stop to help her pick her up, or, that's that sort of thing. And they would answer, on a scale of 1 to 5, yes, no, or I'd actually be busy that day. And apparently using that method will give you a reading of how likely people are to try and give the socially responsible answer. And that's how you treat for it. Seems easy. Let's see how it works in practice.
Have you already talked to Paddy or other dive operators about giving their support for the survey? Because it seems like a lot of the methods are going to depend on the survey.
They do, yes, and I have, and I think you'd expect that. I mean, I know other people in the room have had support from Paddy as one of the dive certification agencies over the years, so I won't be alone in that. But yes, they're enormously supportive. So that's great.
Is there also a chance that you'll get a bias in responses towards people that are contributing more towards livelihoods and ICM, and that the kind of the companies that are, I guess, the bad ones are just not going to care and therefore not respond to your survey?
It's funny because I was thinking actually it might actually go the other way, that the ones that, because it's random in the sense that you send out to a population and you don't know who's going to respond. I was actually thinking I might actually miss those people entirely, so that, but yes, all of those things are possible, but that's one of the reasons for stratifying the population and then being able to check based on size or location or which country they're from, what responses that you're getting. And one good thing about having the support of, say, Paddy Now, your SSI, is and having a fairly strong network in different regions of the population, is that we'll be able to reach those people if they're not responding initially. But it is an important question.
Just following on from that question, I guess I'm not sure if I missed it during your talk, but how are you going to select the fishermen who you're going to talk to?
The first thing I would do would be it would be expected, as I was saying, that they're associated with the dive tourism operator. So the first thing I'd do would be to ask the dive tourism operators which fishes they recommend. Naturally, well, I don't know about naturally, but each of the operators will have associated villages, so there'll be either, in case of some operators, there's one village close by, in others there'll be 3 villages. So the first thing, as I say, there will be to ask the dive tourism operators who they recommend. And then it would be good, I'll be talking to fishers, but would also be quite good to talk to some other people on staff. So if they have kitchen staff, for example, but it would definitely focusing on those people who were fishers, as opposed to staff who might have had another role in terms of their livelihoods.
Yeah, just noting, I suppose, that by getting the contacts only through the dive tourism operators, you might end up with a bunch of people saying, we love dive tourism. So, yeah.
Well, that's one of the reasons for sort of, triangulating by talking to other people. So I wouldn't be just talking to, the pet fishermen from the dive tourism operator, but going into the community and talking to other people who are not fishers, and to community leaders, and making sure that, for example, there's not a gender bias in there. So as much as possible, identifying certain women who are from fishing families and also from non-fishing families. So that's a better way of making sure that there's a clearer understanding of the impacts of whether there's any reduction of overfishing, because they won't necessarily all have that vested interest.
So how do you do that? Do you do that by survey, or is it ad hoc?
But how do you do?
Talking to the fishers or the people in the community or the mayors or whatever.
So in terms of how
do
do
you have a
select
plan
those
how to
people?
manage that?
Yes, I do. So are you saying how do you select those people, or
Yes.
how do you actually do it? So yes, there is key stakeholder interviews with each of those people. So the plan is, as I've said initially, to ask dive tourism operators for their recommendations about which fishers to talk to, and may or may not follow that guidance. And
So
then,
doesn't that bring bias into your survey already, or not? And I'm speaking from ignorance.
I think that there's a possibility that it could, but again, some of that bias is treated for by talking to other people in the community, and the first thing to do would be to go and talk to the mayors and or the village chiefs, and some of those recommendations also, in terms of who to talk to, would come that way.
So I'm not. Sorry.
You're right. You go.
I'm not entirely clear about so how many dive operators you aim to talk to?
In terms of the key stakeholder interviews, I think possibly 3 or 4.
All right.
I would say, and then the associated parties around that dive tourism operator. I think any less, and you probably may not have enough information. And I just did say in one of my slides that, in terms of saturation, when you start getting the same information, you'll sort of stop those interviews and have enough material to go forward with.
So you're going to send the online surveys to a lot of people.
Yes, that'll
and
go
then
out to the
from
whole
that
population.
you're going to select 3 or 4, or how?
No, that would be a sequential design where you do your quantitative first, and then select, and come back and do your qualitative, selected from the quantitative. And there are a couple of reasons for not doing that in this instance. One is the time factor. I don't have time to wait for that data to come back and analyse it and then use that method of selecting those operators. But another is, the point that this young lady was making is that being a random sample, you don't actually know. I mean, the top operators, they may not even respond to the sample. So in that scenario, you'd actually be missing out on the best operators, perhaps. So the selection will be done for those different reasons, the way that I've suggested.
Thanks for an interesting presentation.
Thank you.
I have a question for you about tenure. In the social science literature, it's often considered problematic to kind of set up a binary between formal and informal tenure. Formal being kind of property rights, like private property rights codified, and informal being customary. And there's attention to the fact that tenural systems are often hybridized. So, given that you don't necessarily know where you're going, how can you assume that customary tenure is informal, that it is kind of one particular system and not a combination of several?
Sure. Well, I think that's the very reason that I would actually use that legal research in the beginning to establish which locations or which countries actually recognise traditional marine tenure and which don't. So that would give, so where they do, that's quite clear that it's either going to be in their constitutions or their national legislation. But where they don't, that would be in places like Papua New Guinea or West Papua, for example. But where they don't, it's really going to be a question of then understanding what types of arrangements are in place and how they're working, as you say, the level of formality or informality, but also the range of rights that are associated with that, because it's not all about property rights, as I was saying in my presentation. It's quite often only about perhaps use rights, which means that people who perhaps live along a shore don't have a right to fish that area in the same way as they would if traditional marine tenure was recognised. But they may have traditionally always used that and fished that. So it's sort of nuances. So the idea, of course, is to have an understanding of that for the locations that I do go to. I guess one of the more important questions for me with traditional marine tenure is it's reasonably, there's some reasonable clarity, I suppose, in the framework around, well, if tenure does exist there, formally or informally, what you do and how you do it and what effect that will make, not just for dive tourism operators, but for other users. So, for example, marine protected area managers or other private sector operators like pearl farms, seaweed farms, that kind of thing. I think one of the more interesting questions that comes up is where tenure doesn't exist, then, and we do have open access resources, what's the effect there for livelihoods, or what is the motivation of operators there to make a contribution to livelihoods, because it's not based on an obligation.
Turn back.
A suggestion and then a question. One thing you might consider doing when you're trying to, what you call a triangulation, getting, are people telling you what they think you want to hear, is adding some questions about what they think of some of their competitors' operations. Dive community is very small, and you could get some really interesting information if you ask, well, are you aware of any other shops in your region who are doing X, Y, Z, or not doing X, Y, Z? And that could be some interesting data validation. You can get some really interesting dirt and gossip, frankly. That could help provide context for some of the data that you're getting back. And the question bit is, for your factors for success in ICM, you've got a list of activities. Are you going to look at whether those activities are successful or not? Because you could have one dive operation who does, you're going to have two operations who do exactly the same thing. For example, pay subsidies to a local community. But the outcomes of the paying subsidy could be completely different in different areas. And if you're going to provide advice on how to make a dive operator have the best success in ICM, it might be more important to look at how they do something, whether it's successful, rather than just what they're doing.
That's really very much the reason for doing key stakeholder interviews with 3 or 4 operators instead. I mean, you can't quite do that with the global community, but you can do that with a number of operators who are judged to be doing a great deal and trying to learn from the success that it's an unusual phrase, I suppose, but learn from what they're actually doing. Hi, Matt.
Hi, I really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have you considered, as part of your triangulation process, and this might be really easy to look not just at the supply side of dive tourism but the demand. I think that there's a community of divers out there who are using these and visiting these places and using these resources and contributing to those communities and interacting with those communities that are actually really accessible online through online communities of practice. So you could survey them if you were quite certain.
I think that's a really interesting point, and it's almost, it arises for me as something that comes up, the kind of the consumer side of all of this. Because part of changing the dynamic of perhaps the impact that dive tourism is having on marine conservation is not just to educate perhaps dive tourism operators in terms of what they might be doing better, but also to take that information to the consumer, to the consuming communities, and so that it's a force for changing dive tourism operators by demand. They're demanding operators who do more of these sort of favourable things for communities, or who have better impacts on marine conservation through integrated coastal management. I haven't considered it for this particular project, purely because I guess you have to contain things and it was just a little bit outside of scope, but it certainly is. I think it's a very important thing, and it's probably a next step after, you know, perhaps if you were capable of coming up with the right sort of model, then you would go to the dive tourism community as operators, but also to the conserving community.
Okay. Did you still have a question?
Yeah, just a really short comment or suggestion. Briefly, I guess going back to the question of tenure, in the social science, literature and following from Wolf's comment, it's often not viewed necessarily as a question of whether traditional tenure exists or doesn't exist, or is codified, is not codified. And so I guess I just encourage you to take perhaps a slightly broader view of what tenure can involve. And so, for example, in what might often be considered as, you know, traditionally a very open access resource in parts of the Philippines, for example, there's been social scientists. There's a good chapter by read by Shiro Segi in an ANU press book. I can forward the link if you like, but sort of talks about what is typically in open access zone, but there's all sorts of various social relations that mediate the ways in which people are able to use or not use the resource. So relationships between local municipal fishermen and commercial trawlers, for example, that might come into inshore zones and they share fish and give away fish and things like that. So, that's just a small one.
Well, thank you. Well, it's been great to talk to you. It's great that you're here at the moment. I'm very lucky in that regard. So perhaps we can have a little bit more of a chat about that.
Yeah, sure.
Be good. Thank you.
Okay, we're all done.